Good morning, everyone. My name is Merle Massey. I'm the coordinator for undergraduate research here at the University of Saskatchewan. I'm also the leader of the SURE program, Student Undergraduate Research Experience program here at the university. And today we are joined by Brock, who's from the University of Saskatchewan Student Employment and Career Center. And Brock is going to be giving us hints and tips on how to ace the interview. Brock, over to you.
Thank you, Merle, and thanks everybody for signing on today for this presentation. So I'm just going to find my screen here, and hopefully there we go. Presentation. So just a little bit about myself. I'm an employment coordinator at the Student Employment and Career Center. So my job is really about connecting employers and students with each other, helping employers to find new talent for the various kinds of jobs that they're hiring, helping students find the right companies for them in their job search, in their career search, and really just helping to facilitate and improve those connections that happened between students and employers. And so part of that is educating students on things like how to write an effective resume or cover letter, and a session like today talking about interviewing, which is one of our more popular ones because I think a lot of people really struggle with interviewing. It is an intimidating part of the hiring process, especially for people who haven't done a lot of it, particularly in a professional context. So hopefully a lot of the tips that I talk about here today will be of enormous help to you in approaching interviewing, especially if it's something that maybe makes you a little bit nervous. For anybody who attended my previous presentation on resumes and cover letters, some of this advice is going to sound very similar, and that just really underscores the importance of certain kinds of preparation. But I'll get into that as we go here. So first off, just a brief overview here. I'm going to talk a little bit about the process as a whole. I'm going to talk about some various different types of interview formats because there are a number of them out there right now. Although right now we're going to be seeing pretty much all virtual interviews. So I'll talk a little bit about that as well. I'm going to talk about how to persuasively articulate your knowledge, your experience, your skills, and also your career goals, which are helpful or important to understand and be able to articulate to a potential employer. And then just some techniques on how to respond effectively to common and challenging interview questions. And I'm going to go through a list of, I think it's about 8 or 10 of the most common and often most challenging interview questions, and talk a little bit about how to approach those. So first off, just an overview of the interview and its purpose. Really, it's the opportunity. It's the next step in the hiring process after you provided them with your cover letter and your resume. You've articulated your knowledge, your skills, your interest in working for that organization through those documents enough to get them to bring you in for the interview. And so it's an opportunity for you to elaborate a little bit more on your skills, your knowledge and experience, and other relevant qualities to the position that they are hiring. And for them to ask questions, a little bit more specific questions that really dig into some of the details about your capabilities, your competencies as it relates to that job, as it relates to that company as well. For those who really get very nervous about interviews, for me, one of the most helpful tips is really to think of the interview as a conversation between you and the employer, and you're each trying to learn a little bit more about each other. As much as they're trying to find out if you're a good fit for this position and that company, you're also trying to find out if it's a good fit for you. And so I'll talk a little bit later about how it's important actually at the end to make sure that you're asking questions of them as well. So first, a little bit about some of the different interview formats out there that you might encounter. The most common one is the in-person or now virtual interview with one interviewer or a panel. Sometimes you'll have 3 people interviewing you. Nowadays, it's going to be a lot of Skype, maybe WebEx versions of that. But more or less, the advice is the same that I'll get into as it applies in person or virtual. Sometimes through the hiring process, they might send you questions in advance that maybe they're just typed out. Maybe you go to their website to respond in that way. That is becoming a more common thing in certain industries, not in all. Telephone interviews are quite common, usually as kind of like a pre-interview. So before they bring you in for the formal panel style interview, they might set up maybe a 10 or 20-minute phone call. It's kind of like a screening portion of the hiring process. All the same advice, though, for preparing for interviews would apply for that telephone interview. Skype, I guess that's our virtual interviews there. Group interviews, not super common. I think it's maybe a little bit more common in certain kind of retail organizations where usually I think there's like 2 or 3 interviewers and then maybe like up to 20 potential candidates, and you're all in a room together interviewing at the same time. And it's a little bit about making sure that your voice is heard and that you're talking and expressing yourself, but not dominating. So it's about how you interact with the other potential candidates and the interviewers. And so it's a very different dynamic, but not an overly common one. Assessments, testing, case style, certain types of organizations or certain types of industries will build in this additional components to really assess your skill sets. So that would be something that you see through our office. We always give people a test on like Microsoft Words and Excel just to see that they have basic competency with those things because they are so important to the job. So that's the kind of thing that you might see. Presentations, another fairly common thing that you would be asked to do. We often do them in our office. We ask candidates to, prepare a 10 to 15-minute presentation on a specific topic that's given to them in advance. So they create a PowerPoint and deliver that, usually at the end of the main portion of the interview, as a way to kind of wrap that up. It's particularly important for jobs where presenting is a part of that job. It's a way of really assessing that skill set. Reception dining. I've heard of that in certain industries, like maybe like accounting, for instance, where it's really about how you interact with other people, getting to know your personality a little bit more because it's such a client-focused industry. They want to see how you interact in that sort of environment. Role play. I had a role play one once when I applied for a position at an art gallery as a docent. And the interviewers basically acted as visitors to the gallery, and I had to take them around and show them what the art was about. And they asked me some tough questions related to the appropriateness of certain types of art pieces, and I had to respond to that. So that was an interesting type of interview there. And then occasionally, some companies, they will have second and subsequent interviews. So you have maybe a telephone interview, first interview, second interview. So that does happen sometimes, especially as you perhaps get a little bit later into your career. So those are the most common kinds of interview formats that you will find. So next, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of those steps that you need to make sure that you're taking to prepare for those interviews. And so a lot of this really reflects the advice that I'd given in the resume and cover letter presentation. So the first one there is researching the firm. Showing that you've taken that initiative to research who they are, what they do, check out their website, their about page or Wikipedia, see if there's any news articles about them, really get to know that organization, because you'll often get asked a question, something like, just tell us what you know about our company, or tell us what you know about our department specifically. And they'll really be impressed if you can speak at some length about that organization, about that department, about that kind of work. That will be very, very impressive to them. So make sure that you are doing that work. And just understanding the role and the position. So what I recommend everybody does before the interview, read job posting 2, 3, 4 times, whatever it takes to really, really understand it. Know what's in there. Know what they're looking for a candidate. That's going to be clues for you as to some of the questions that they're going to be asking. It's going to be talking about skill words, experience, knowledge. Those are the kinds of things that they're going to be asking you. because again, they want to see how closely you fit to the position that they've described in that job posting. So just a reminder, always save the job posting, print it off, save it onto your desktop, wherever you need to, just so that you can make sure that you have access to that if you do get the interview, because if you just leave it online, it'll disappear and you won't be able to see it again. Know yourself. So again, similar to before you're preparing your resume and your cover letter, just doing a bit of an inventory, thinking about your education, thinking about what your career path is, think about your career goals and how this position is going to fit into your overall career path and career goals. You might get asked a very specific question about how does this position connect to your long-term or short-term career goals? And so you'll want to have thought about that beforehand and make a nice connection there. And continuing on that inventory, knowing your skill set. This is going to be so important that you really are able to articulate in detail what your skills or competencies are. Again, thinking back to that job posting, thinking about, I talked about this last presentation about resumes, thinking about both your soft skills, your transferable skills, and also the hard skills that are specific to that position that you're applying for. So be able to provide evidence for those skill sets, drawing on wherever you can, volunteering, school, work, obviously, to really be able to provide very thorough, elaborate responses that very effectively articulate the skills that you have. So all that preparation is going to make your interview go much, much more smoothly. So getting ready to market yourself. So some of these things I've already covered here. I'm just going to see if there's anything else I might need to mention. Things like identifying accomplishments that you are proud of and the things that you might have done differently. So accomplishments, really great way to sell your skill sets, your ability, your potential. If you can draw on that from school, again, volunteering, work, wherever you can draw on specific accomplishments or major projects that you've worked on. It is, if they ask for more detail on those sorts of things, sometimes it can be helpful to think about the process that you took in getting to that accomplishment, working on that project, thinking about what you learn from that. That can be very important as well. Showing your self-awareness, self-reflection. So reflecting on something like what you would have done differently to improve it next time. That it shows a lot of maturity, and that those are all things that employers are really looking for and that they take very seriously. So I think more or less I've covered everything there. So let's talk a little bit about professional etiquette and looking the part for the interview. So, I mean, in a virtual world, this still really applies, the dressing appropriately in business casual or semi-formal attire. The general rule is try to dress one up from whatever you think the standard workplace attire would be. So if standard workplace attire is kind of like business casual, so maybe for men it's like a dress shirt and a tie and dress pants and dress shoes. Maybe throw a blazer on just to dress it up a little bit more, just to be on the safe side. So that's going to be very important. And again, even virtual interviewing, you know, throw on a blazer and a tie, whatever it is, to look the part for that, even though it is virtual. For in-person interviews, it is really important to be aware of wearing scented products like too much cologne or perfume. I was in an interview one time where somebody came in just basically drenched in perfume. One of the interviewers had a really severe allergy to perfumes, and so it was an extremely painful interviewer for her, and unfortunately, it didn't really go well for the interviewee either. So I would just avoid, you know, any heavily scented products for in-person interviews. Also, don't chew gum. It's good to have fresh breath. Just use a mint. That's the best way to do that. Handshaking. It's kind of an important part of the interview. There isn't such a thing as a professional handshake. So practice your professional handshake. You know, a firm handshake, not the floppy fish kind of thing, or the sweaty palm. And so what you would do is when you walk into the interview room, you're going to shake the hands of each of the interviewers and introduce yourself. And then at the end of the interview, you're going to thank them again and shake their hands again. And so you want to be prepared to have a nice professional impression through that handshake. And just always remind people, you maybe don't think about it, but a nice smile does go a long way in how you present yourself. So your demeanor is something to be somewhat aware of in the interview. Okay. Oh, and I'll come back to this maybe a little bit later. I always kind of harp on this one because it is so important now. Googling yourself and making sure your online presence is polished. So if the hiring manager or committee has not looked you up online prior to the interview, they probably will if they're interested at the end of the interview. So do make sure that you are aware of what your online presence looks like. So that might mean just setting your privacy settings really high on your Facebook or Twitter or whatever it might be, or it might be cleaning up some of that content. So just always be aware of that. It's so important right now. Okay, so let's get into some of the key questions that you should or that you need to be able to answer in any interview. So tell me about yourself. Most interviews start off with a version of this question. They just say it like that. Just give us an introduction to who you are. So it's important to practice that one. Might be the next slide. I have a strategy for you to approach that question. It's one that a lot of people really struggle with that one. They're just not comfortable talking about themselves. They don't necessarily do it a lot, and it's an uncomfortable kind of thing. So there is a way to help you get through that. So we'll get into that in the next slide. Why did you decide to go to study your program, or why did you decide to study the program that you did? So sometimes they will ask a question like that. They want to hear why you studied biology or English or chemistry or whatever it is. Like, what was it about that that subject that really, grabbed your interest, and this made you decide to study that as a degree and to want to follow that potentially into a career. So be able to talk about that. It's surprising how many people actually struggle to articulate why they studied what they studied. There's that one that I mentioned before. What do you know about our organization? So again, be prepared for that one. What are your long-term career goals? I kind of mentioned that one as well. The reason for asking that is to see whether that potential candidate has actually thought about why they want this job and made that connection, or is it just a situation where they just need a job and they just need to make money? Which that's fair if that's the case, but you ultimately or ideally you want to hire a candidate who has a real commitment to wanting to work for your organization, to wanting to learn in that position and to grow in that position. So be able to make that connection. What are your interests? Why are you interested in this position? Often a very direct question that you'll get. So be able to talk about, that job description. You read that job posting a few times now. You should be able to talk about it in some detail. What is it about it that really engaged you? What is it that made you just have to apply for this position? So be able to talk about that in some detail. What are your strengths and weaknesses? I think I'll come back to that in a couple slides. And then how are you a good fit for this organization, or why should we hire you? That's the kind of question that they'll often wrap up an interview with. And basically they're just looking for you to make a nice summary, put a bow on it. Why should we hire you for this position? So touch on, your skill sets, your experience, why that's a good fit, why you're super interested in it, in that position, in that company. Bring it all together for that wrap up question there. So really important to practice that one as well. A lot of people stumble over that one. It's really important that you don't stumble past that question. Okay, so the tell me about yourself question. Here's an approach that works really well called pause. So that's where you would start off talking about something personal. For myself, I'd usually just say, I was born in Saskatoon. I lived in Vancouver for a little while. I live in Regina to my undergraduate degree. I like hiking in the weekends and spending time with my girlfriends, and that's about where I would leave it. It doesn't have to be too personal. It's really just whatever you're comfortable with, but it's just to kind of give a little more well-rounded picture about who you are. It doesn't have to be very long either. Next thing you want to talk about is your academics. So just tell your academic story a little bit. If you can tie it back to this position, that's great. Talk about your work experience, mostly focus on the relevant work experience. And again, as it hopefully relates or connects to this position that you're applying for. And then this is the part that people struggle with a little bit at the beginning. Talk about your skills, your strengths, your expertise. I would think about it mostly in terms of describing your top strengths. What are you uniquely really good at? Because that's how you want to sell yourself and market yourself. So you might want to bring it up right there at the beginning. If writing is your thing, that is where you excel, and that's important. Talk about that right there. Let them know that that's the case. So that's a really great way to approach that question. I would practice that one. I've encouraged people who struggle with it to write out a response beforehand and just kind of, make sure that they understand it and hit off all the important points. If that's helpful for you, that's a good approach. So here's a question about strengths and weaknesses. So you might get a direct question like, tell us about your top 3 strengths, for instance. So be prepared to have 3 strengths that you can talk about in some detail. Talk about how you develop them, why they're strengths of yours, talk in some detail about, the ways in which you are strong in those particular skill sets. Again, keep in mind that they should absolutely be relevant to the position that you're applying to. But yeah, be able to talk in some detail about those things. Weaknesses question, you don't get it in every interview. Sometimes they'll ask, tell us what your biggest weakness is, something like that. It really throws people off. I don't personally feel that it necessarily gives the interviewers a lot of really good information, except when somebody says something just horribly bad, like they have a hard time showing up for work on time. Punctuality is not their strength. I've actually heard that one in an interview, and it's like, okay, well, I guess we can't hire you then. So don't get caught off guard by this question. Think about a weakness that you can talk about. I think the ideal approach for this is something that's maybe actually related to the job in some way. An example would be, so the job description said that they want somebody with 5 years experience doing this particular thing. You might not have that. That's okay. You can identify that is, maybe a deficit as far as the job description goes, but then you need to articulate why that's not going to be a problem, because you're a great learner, because the skill sets that you have make up for that lack of experience, whatever it is. Sell on why that's not going to be a problem. Maybe you've been working on this in certain ways. So like public speaking is one that a lot of people will use in this for this response. So maybe they've been doing presentations in classes, maybe they've been joined Toastmasters or been involved in student groups that involve some kind of public speaking. Talk about how you've been developing or improving in that area. That's a great way to respond to the weakness question. Okay, let's move on. So most interviews, the core of the questions that they're going to be asking you are behavioral-based interview questions. And the theory behind that is that future performance is best predicted by your past performance. So they want you to talk about the past work experience that you've had, school, volunteering, whatever it is. They want to hear that evidence for those skill sets. So these are very skill-focused kinds of questions. So there's some examples down there. Tell us about a time when you played a leadership role in an event at work or on a project. How did you lead the efforts? How did others respond to your leadership? The next one there, tell me about a time when you experienced conflict and how you handled it. So with the behavioral-based interview questions, it can be helpful to think about what's the skill set or skill area or conglomeration of skills that they really want me to talk about here. So that first one, it's pretty obvious. It's leadership. It's probably a little bit about teamwork as well. So that's what they're going to want to hear about. So think of examples that can allow you to elaborate on how you have that skill. The next one, conflict. So conflict management would be the skill, communication would be the skill, empathy maybe a little bit. So there's a few different things that play into that. So think of an example that you can discuss that allows you to elaborate on that skill set that really demonstrates that you have it. So that's the ideal way to approach these kinds of questions. I can't remember if I have. Let's skip ahead right here. So there's actually an acronym that can help you approach these kinds of questions. It's called SOAR, SOAR. And so it can help you frame your response for behavioral-based questions. So SOAR, the S stands for situation. So describe the situation that you were in. That's going to allow you to talk about this experience, this skill set. Then describe the obstacles that you've faced in that particular situation. Then talk about the actions that you took. Thinking about the thought process that took you through those actions. And then the R is to talk about the result. And a lot of people kind of skip that point, but it's really important to actually what happened in the end. Was the conflict resolved? How did the relationship evolve after the actions that you took? Maybe it didn't work out all that well for you. What did you learn from that? What would you do differently? So you can actually, in this case, use maybe a negative example. That's not necessarily a bad thing. If you can, again, talk about what you learned from that situation, how you would do it differently in the future. Because again, it does show your ability to reflect, shows your maturity, the ability to learn all important things. So that can be an approach that you might want to take there. One other point on this, if you can't think of an example, if you're really stuck, what you could do is talk about how you would hypothetically approach the situation. So a thought process for dealing with conflict with a colleague or a client or whatever it might be. How would you approach that sort of situation? It's better than not being able to give any kind of response at all. It allows them to hear what your approach, it at least allows you to talk about the skill to some extent, and that's what they hear about. So that can be a way of approaching that as well. Okay. Just a few different examples here, things that you might see. Yeah. Tell me about a time when you felt that you dealt with a situation inadequately, and how has that changed how you would approach the same situation? So sometimes they'll ask you a very direct question, like they want to hear a negative example. So maybe it can be helpful to actually have thought of one beforehand. That's one that we often ask. We want to hear about that capacity for learning and growth and adaptability, all important things. So you might get a question like that. Can provide a recent example of when you were under stress and how you coped. That's one for certain jobs that we do often ask. We want to hear about your coping mechanisms, especially if this is the kind of workplace where it can be very stressful. We want to know how you're going to handle that. That can be very, very important to know. Tell me about a time when you made a significant contribution to a team. Any job that you're working for, you're probably going to be working with a team of some kind. They want to know how you get along with other people, how you work with people, how you communicate, all very important things. So that's just some more examples there of behavioral type questions that you might see in an interview. Okay, so tricky questions, ones that people really, really stumble with. Sometimes interviewers might ask tough or silly questions just to see how you respond on your feet. One question that I got one time was, if they were going to make a movie about your life, how would it end, and who would play you? And I just had no response to that. I stumbled through it. That was a tricky question. I mean, I came up with something in the end, but the point of it was really just to see how you think on your feet with a unexpected kind of question. So understand that's all it's really about. It doesn't have to be a perfect response or anything. You can kind of maybe have a little bit of fun with those types of questions. Another one people have gotten apparently is like, what's your spirit animal? Try to have a little bit of fun with it. Don't take it too seriously. It's more about how you think on your feet that they're trying to figure out there. Yeah. So there are other kinds of questions that people are more common, but people really, really struggle with. So one of the most common is, what salary are you expecting? And people will often come to us and ask, well, how do I respond to that? That's without, eliminating my possibility of getting the job because I've said something too high, but at the same time without undercutting what I'm worth. So it is tricky. So what you want to do is you want to think about this one beforehand. Always, for every job interview, think about it beforehand. If there's a certain range, perhaps, that you're thinking, maybe you want to say the range. Um, Check out Glassdoor or other websites that maybe have salaries or average salaries for certain kind of positions. If you're just not at all aware of what the salary or hourly rate might be that they're paying, because a lot of job postings, they won't tell you that. They won't give you that information in advance. So you're going to want to do a bit of research on that and think about it. You can kind of dodge the question a little bit as well. Maybe saying something like, based on my experience and my skill sets, I'm sure that you'll make a fair offer. And really, I'm just excited to work for this organization. And, it's something that, we can talk about if there's a job offer. So you can kind of dodge it like that if you want, if you're not comfortable. But for some people, like, there's a minimum that they just will not work below. If that's the case, you might as well say it. Like, if you're not willing to work below $50,000 and you're not sure what they're willing to pay, you might as well say it, because if their target number is, 38, then it saves everybody a lot of time and efforts afterwards. So you might as well just say that salary rate. What do your references, or what do you think your references will say about you? That's really tricky, because they're going to be calling your references. So you don't want to oversell what you think your references are going to say. But it is actually important to think about, what are your references going to say about you? And, they're going to talk about your work ethic, how you get along with others, what your skill sets are. So kind of keep it in that zone, I think. What part of the job sounds most challenging to you, and why? So, maybe think about that one beforehand as well, because, as I mentioned in the resume and cover letter presentation, the job description really, it's outlining what they think the ideal candidate is for this position. So rarely do they ever find the ideal candidate. There's going to be elements of it, any job, that people will maybe struggle with a little bit more than others. So, it can be a good thing to show that self-awareness, that reflection there. But again, it's kind of like the weakness question. Talk about why that's, not a problem, or why that's maybe even an exciting thing for you. Like, it's an opportunity to learn. That can be a great way of responding to that. And what is your dream job? We've thrown that at people before. The trick about that one is that we're not actually necessarily looking for you to say that this is your ultimate dream job, especially for like a really entry-level position. But that's okay. What you want to do is, again, it's like the goals question, make that connection to your ultimate career plans. What are you going to learn about this skill sets through this job that's going to be a benefit to you? Why is this job so exciting and interesting to you? And make that connection. So those are some tricky questions that you might have to deal with. But then there's another tricky question, the inappropriate kind of tricky question. So there are actually, like, labor laws about this, or human rights legislation about this. There's certain things that you're just not allowed to ask a candidate about in an interview, but that doesn't mean that you won't get them. Sometimes interviewers, they just don't understand that. They're not really thinking about it. They don't have a proper HR person there with them. They're maybe just the managers or coordinators who work in a certain department. Their profession is not hiring, and they might ask an inappropriate question. So things that are off limits are asking questions about race, age, religion, color, place of birth, disability, marital status, children. All of those are off limits. One of the more common ones I've heard, it's not super common, but I have heard about it. Female candidates have been asked, do you intend to have children in the next year or two? Totally off base. You can't ask that. You don't need to respond to it. But the trick then for you is how do you respond to that? So there are different approaches, and you might want to think about this beforehand as well. How would you respond to an inappropriate question? Um, I'd say that for some people, it's like, yeah, they don't care. They'll tell you, and if you're comfortable saying what it is, say what it is. You can just say, I'm aware that's not an appropriate question. I don't feel comfortable answering that. You can take that approach. Um, Maybe a better approach is to think about, because there's always something behind it. They're asking that question about children. Think about what's behind that. They're worried that you're going to get onto a major project or something like that and then immediately leave 6 months in, to have a baby. It's still not appropriate for them to ask that, but maybe just try to address the underlying concern, I suppose, that you think that they might have. And in that case, maybe it's reiterating that you're committed to this organization and to this company, and that's what's really important. And so you can kind of dance around it a little bit, and that might be a good approach to it. But anyway, these are tricky. It does happen once in a while, unfortunately. So it's important to think about how you would approach that sort of situation. At the end of the interview, they should always wrap it up by saying, "Do you have any questions for us, the interviewers?" It is very, very important that you do, and that your questions are thoughtful questions for them. So really building on what you've learned about the organization and the position. Maybe it's asking questions about the kinds of projects that you might be working on, things that wouldn't have been described in the job posting, or maybe they didn't articulate to you in the interview. Things that really give you a much better understanding of the daily work life. Maybe a question like, tell me what a typical day would look like in this position. What Who I'll be working with, the team that I would be a part of, things like that. Things that really, again, just give you a deeper level of understanding of the position that you would be going into. Because again, this is your opportunity to learn if it's a good fit for you. So you want to ask questions that relate to that. Another common question might be asking about the company culture, which is very important for it's important for everybody, I think, to understand what the environment is like that you're going to be working in. So you can ask them a question like, what do you like about working for this organization? Or can you tell me a little bit about the company culture and what that's like? Those are important questions and great questions to ask. So again, things that they're thoughtful questions, important questions to you as a potential candidate, as a potential employee. So I would recommend at least 3 or 4 questions. Sometimes they'll answer it through the course of the interview. That's fine. I've had people come into interviews with a list of questions written down. There were like 8 or 10 questions, but all of them were thoughtful, important questions that really showed how engaged they really were in getting that position, and that was impressive. That impressed the interviewers. So that is a good approach to potentially take. I don't know if I need to add much more here. Other than that last point, questions related to salary, benefits, etc., that should be avoided and saved for the negotiation phase following a formal job offer, ideally. So if you don't talk about salary in the interview, it's. I mean, you can do it, and maybe they won't care, and that's fine. But it's more best practice, I guess, to just wait to see if they actually want to offer you a job and talk about it then. And then you can do that salary negotiation and talk about benefits and all those sorts of things at that point. So that's my recommendation for whether or not to ask those kinds of questions at the interview phase. It's kind of just going to wrap it up here, summarizing a lot of the key points here. So preparation is key. The 4 R's. So this kind of summarizes the whole thing here. So research the position in the company. Very, very important that you have a solid understanding of them and the position. Do that reflection and inventory taking of your skills and your abilities, your qualities, your knowledge, all of those things. Read and reread your resume and be prepared to use a variety of examples pulling from that. So often with your resume, it doesn't include everything you've ever done, but that's what they're going to be asking specific questions on potentially. So sometimes they'll look at this job that you did here at this time and they want to know a little bit more about it. So just remember what you have in the resume so that you're prepared to talk about any of those things that you put in there. Same with your cover letter. I guess the reading and rereading, again, applies to the job posting as well. Make sure you're doing that. And then review some common interview questions. And just at the end here, I'll go to our website and point out where you can find some more of those. Yeah, and the better prepared you are, the more confident you're going to feel. I can't reiterate that enough. It goes a long way to kind of allaying some of that anxiety that you might feel going into an interview, is that proper preparation. It's just going to make it so much easier for you. So yeah, I think some of this is just repetition here. Yeah, again, prepare those questions to ask at the end of the interview. Dress appropriately, be punctual, friendly, and courteous. So especially if it's an in-person interview, common practice, probably show up like 10 to 15 minutes beforehand. Don't show up like an hour before, because that's just or half hour. It's just too soon. It makes them stress out that you're sitting there waiting potentially. Don't do that, but don't cut it too close either. So aim for that 15 to 10 minutes is probably appropriate. And then one really important point that not a lot of people do, and they don't realize it's important, is to send a thank you email to the interviewer or interviewers 24 to 48 hours after the interview. And it doesn't have to be a very long email. It's just thanking them for the opportunity and for the conversation, and maybe reiterating why it is that you're so interested in wanting to work for them in this company, and maybe more so now that you've gone through the interview, and really just selling that again, that passion and that interest. Some people have used this as an opportunity to maybe clarify a question that they kind of stumbled over or somehow answered incorrectly. It's just an opportunity to say, I just wanted to make a clarification on this particular point here. You can use that as an opportunity to do that there as well. So yeah, even a few hours after the interview, that's totally fine if you want to send it then. If you don't have all their contact information, maybe ask for their business cards at the end of the interview, just so that you can email all of them, or at the very least, forward it to whoever that initial email is, and then they can forward it to the interviewers. So very, very important to do that. Some hiring committees and hiring managers actually take that fairly seriously, because they want to know that you really are very interested. So make sure to always do that. And then I think I kind of already touched on this, social media. Just make sure that you're aware. They're going to be checking it out, Googling you, checking out all of your different social media accounts. So just be very cautious of what you have on there. Okay, so just before questions, I'm going to quickly jump over to the website. So this is the students.usask.ca website. The job section here is our content. There's the resumes and CV stuff there, career planning stuff, and the interviewing. So the interviewing page, there's the interview guide. A lot of that I've given you today, plus a couple other helpful ones. It's going to give you a whole bunch of skill-based behavioral type questions that you can think about. There's 10 essential interview questions listed here, which just go a little bit beyond what I gave you. I recommend that everybody is prepared before every interview to answer any of those questions. And even if that's the bare minimum that you do, I think that will be a huge, huge help for you. So that's the interview guide. And then just lastly here, down under view common interview questions, there's a whole bunch of interview questions. You don't have to know how you respond to all of them, but it can be helpful to just kind of skim through and see what some kinds of interview questions are that you might potentially get. Just helps get your brain thinking about how to respond to different sorts of questions posed to you. And then as well, at the Student Employment Career Center, we do mock interviews. So those are half-hour one-on-one appointments, virtual appointments right now. So about 15 minutes of that is practicing an actual interview, a mock interview, and then 15 minutes is just giving you some feedback on how you did, ways to improve, and then answering any questions that you might have. So that's it. That wraps it up. I'm going to close my screen here, and then I guess we can move on to any questions that people might have.
Thanks so much, Brock. That was just phenomenal as usual. So full of so much information. We've had a couple of questions that came in, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop the recording for right now, and then we'll answer the questions outside the recording.
Sounds good.